The Indian subcontinent has been the cradle of a large number of civilizations. These civilizations were based on political dynasties. They have been recorded in terms of their rise and fall. These civilizations were known by their respective cultures and traditions. Often these cultures were not indigenous. They were tempered by their contacts and connections with the world outside the geographical boundaries of the subcontinent. This suggests their contacts and connections with the world outside. North Indian civilizations, as well as their counterparts in the Deccan and the far south, have always had interactions with the world beyond the shores of India.
Despite the apparent natural frontiers or the natural boundaries created by the Himalayas in the north and the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, there have been a large number of people who have traced their journeys from their original homeland to the places where they visited in India. The period under review has seen the coming of the Arabs as well as the coming of the Turks, all within a span of 500 years.
The Arabs were not the first foreigners to visit India.
As recorded history has shown us, from the northwest, along the northwestern mountains, through the passes, there have been series of invasions by the Huns, the Shokos, not to mention the original migrations made by the Aryans.
The Arab influence in India took place after Islam had consolidated itself in the Semitic world. It extended its boundaries beyond the Middle East in various ways. These included military, socio-economic, and cultural contacts of the Arabs with North India.
The Arab invasions, which we are locating in the early 8th century, must have been preceded by contacts with North India and the western coastline between traders of the Indian ports and the Arab merchants who came in their dhows and who brought their goods from the Arab world to India, carrying back with them the produce which they found in the continent.
The initial contacts of the Arabs with North India were not military in nature. Rather, they were commercial. They reflected what might be called the commercial extension of Islam into India through overland and maritime trade.
Together with the traders, there were a large number of hangers-on, perhaps people who served on the boats, on the dhows. Perhaps across the Hindu Kush, there were those who came simply as travelers, eager to know more about a land which they had heard from, stories carried back by these Arab merchants. There must have been a group of theologians, of mendicants, of a group of people who are known as the Sufis, who extended this frontier of Islam from the Islamicate world to what was then known to the Arabs as Al-Hind.
The Arab invasion of India was led by Mohammad bin Qasim. The Arabs conquered Sindh. With this conquest, the extension of the commercial frontier of Islam moved beyond Sindh. It moved into the interiors of North India. But the political frontier was limited to the region of Sindh.
Mohammad bin Qasim, who is acknowledged as the leader of the Arab military forces, and he is facing the opponent in Sindh, which was the Hindu Shahi kingdom. The date that is usually remembered is 712 AD, when Mohammad bin Qasim defeats Dahir, who was the main leader of the resistance in Sindh and establishes settlements in certain pockets of Sindh.
The major source of information for the Arab invasion of Sindh is the Chachnama. It is a compilation of the documents that were originally written as part of the Arab conquest between 712 AD and 714 AD. This was later translated into Persian in the 13th century.
The Chachnama mentions that Mohammad bin Qasim overran Sindh, defeated Dahir, who was the leader of the resistance, the main leader of the resistance in Sindh, and established Arab settlements in certain pockets of Sindh. The areas being Multan, Dabol, Brahmanabad, Nairun, among others. The settlements were of a nature in which there was a great degree of interaction between the Arab conquerors and the indigenous population of Sindh. The Arab army, led by Mohammad bin Qasim, did not consist entirely of Arab military personnel. There were a large number of local Jat and Mayo mercenaries, which gives us an entirely new focus into the Arab invasion of Sindh.
The Arabs were followed by the Turks. They came to India during the 11th, 12th, and the 13th centuries. The initial raids were led by Mahmud of Ghazni. The Ghaznavid invasions began around 1000 AD and continued for about 26 years. These were characterized by the extension of the commercial as well as the political frontiers of Islam beyond Sindh into India.
What happens between 1000 and 1025 AD is a sudden upsurge of what is usually called the violence involved with the Muslim conquests. There are a large number of cases of temple destruction, of very bloody battles, and here in particular we might mention the sack of Somnath, which takes place in 1026. This entire range of invasions or expeditions, which were brief, which were bloody, and which ended with loot and plunder being taken back to Ghazni. There was no consideration of establishing any permanent hold over the areas which had been conquered. The sources, therefore, were the history known as Tarikh-e-Yamini by Al-Utbi. We are also looking at Ferishta's Tarikh-e-Firoz Shahi, which refer to the invasions of Mahmud of Ghazni.
The next series of incursions into India were those of Mohammad Ghori. He invaded this part of the world around the last decade of the 12th century. Later, some of his trusted generals stayed back in Delhi and established the Sultanate on Indian soil.
To go back to the sources, for Mohammad of Ghori, we have any number of 13th century documents. Particularly, we are talking about Juzjani, whose Tabakat-e-Nasiri gives a detailed account of Mohammad of Ghori's invasions. And this is taken up by other historians or chroniclers of the 13th and the 14th centuries.
Prithviraj Chauhan was the chief Indian adversary of Mohammad Ghori. A couple of battles between the two are documented. These are the First Battle of Tarain, fought in 1191 AD, followed by the Second Battle of Tarain, fought in 1192 AD.
It was clear that the Ghorid invasions were not raids of loot and plunder. They were not simply iconoclastic raids, but they were moves perhaps to look at the possibilities of extending the Ghorid Empire into North India beyond the northwest frontier mountains.
Between the 8th and the 11th centuries, the political frontier of Islam did not extend beyond Sindh. Arab invasion of Sindh conjures in our mind images of horse-riding Bedouins rushing into Sindh. But the Arab entity did not consist of only the nomads. It was beyond the world of desert and the Bedouins.
As far as Arab society was concerned, there were hierarchies which were immediately being represented through the people who came with the Arabs. To begin with, at the very outset, the Arabs were very particular about their own social position, and they considered any other non-Arab Muslims to be of a depressed status. So immediately we are looking at an opposition within the Arab armies. Secondly, within Arab society, the community which resided in the oases were of a more sedentary nature. They were much more orthodox. They were perhaps much more organized, as opposed to the nomads whose lifestyle indicated that they were constantly on the move. Their society was not an ordered society, and their religious beliefs were also not as orthodox as that of the oasis-based Ummah. So when the Arabs are coming to India, it is a mixture of all these elements which constitute the Arab ethos. And together with the Arabs, there were a large number of Khorasanis from eastern Iran, there were Afghans, there were several small Turkish tribes who had joined the Arab armies during these invasions.
The Arab invasion involved a large number of communities. Similarly, the army of Mahmud of Ghazni consisted of the Arabs, the Khorasanis, and the Afghans, besides the Turks.
The Ghaznavid attacks between 1000 AD and 1026, we will find that in the army of Mahmud of Ghazni, there were not only Turks who comprised the bulk of the army, and again, within the Turks, we are talking about a group which was later known as the slave element, the slave bureaucracy, the Bandegan, the Mamluks. Apart from these, there were Arabs, there were Khorasanis, there were Afghans who made up the entire bandwagon which accompanied Mahmud of Ghazni in his repeated expeditions into North India. Mohammad of Ghori, who comes towards the end of the 12th and the early 13th century, is again the leader of a composite element. The Bandega form the core element. There are Arabs, there are Tajiks, and there is an added element here known as the Khalaj. The Khalaj are supposed to be originally Turks, but not in the pure sense of the term, and they have perhaps been Turkicized people resident in the neighborhood. So on the one hand, we find that if we are disaggregating the entire body of Muslims who invaded India, we find that there is a whole admixture of communities, of cultures, of social background, of economic background who have entered India through these events which have been highlighted.
The Arab and the Turkish invaders consisted of a composite multitude. Similarly, the people of North India at that time belonged to a number of communities and culturally diverse groups. Perhaps this was the primary reason that led to a fusion of religion and culture in the post-invasion scenario.
To look at this or these series of encounters as one between Islam and Hinduism is incorrect as far as history is concerned. The population of North India, or at least those who came into contact with the different sets of military encounters, did not always belong to the same region. The Arabs met the people of Sindh. The Ghaznavids met the people of the Punjab and Gujarat perhaps. The Ghorids were the ones who came furthest down into the plains of North India. So they were not all Hindus. They were not all speaking the same language. And culturally, as well as economically, they were located in different regions. Which means that we are talking about a fusion. We are talking about a fusion of different worlds, of different communities, of different consciousness of religion and culture.
Prior to the 11th century, the political arm of Islam did not spread beyond Sindh. But between the 11th and the 13th centuries, the nature of the impact had taken a tremendous leap forward.
It was a world which had moved beyond the binaries of a mercantile, nomadic community opposing a settled rural community. It had gone beyond the simple equation of a mobile, an area or a frontier of mobile mercantile wealth facing an area of more or less dependable, static, landed wealth. And we are now moving into a zone where the impact of these moving frontiers would begin to tell on North India itself. The fusion that we are talking about, a fusion between the world of Islam or the Islamicate world and the world that was known as Al-Hind to these so-called conquerors, first began to manifest itself through an increase in the volume of trade, which came in and out of India.
Around this time, Indian trade with the outside world was restricted to the northwest frontier passages and the ports along the Arabian Sea.
Using the contacts of the Turks and the Arabs, the trade now went beyond. It went into the Middle East region, beyond the Middle East to Transoxiana. It also drew into its range of activities the trade of the Eurasian commercial groups. And if we look eastwards, we find that the volume and extent of trade was now going straight into China.
With the coming of the Turks, that is, between the 11th and the 13th centuries, there was a change in the nature of the political organization. By this time, the Islamic world had also undergone a process of internal transformation. There had been contacts with the classical Greek traditions.
The Islamicate world was opening up, and it naturally would extend this efflorescence into areas where they would have contact. This was also a time when, within the Turkish or Arab world, a new political system was evolving. A new despotic tradition was evolving, which gradually drew together the disparate nomads, the disparate settled communities of the oases, the various horsemen coming from Transoxiana, from Khorasan, from various settlements of the Turks, into one settled community which would be under a despotic umbrella. They had also by this time begun to develop institutions such as Kharaj, which was a land revenue system, a tax of land revenue. They had begun to develop systems of collecting a kind of capitation fee known as the jizya. They had begun to reorganize their military strength, which all added to what we might call the institutional guarantees of a new despotic order. And it is this despotic order which was established in North India in the course of the 13th century.
The first 50 to 60 years of the Turkish rule in India was not the period that saw a single unitary state. These were still regional kingdoms looked after by the generals of Mohammad Ghori.
Mohammad of Ghori's lieutenants, who were left behind by him to look after his extended Indian possessions or territories, one of whom was Qutubuddin Aibak. And Qutubuddin Aibak later is remembered as the founder of the Mamluk dynasty of the 13th century.
The process that had been set in motion as a result of the three invasions finally resulted in the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate.
The Arab invasions, the expeditions of Mahmud of Ghazni, and finally the Ghorid conquests, each had their own story to tell. Each had a particular role to play in the extension of Islam. Islam when it was trying to impress the world. Islam when it was trying to show that this was an alternate system. The conquerors or the military leaders had to seek some kind of legitimacy through Islam. But they were not necessarily carrying the sword of Islam. They were not necessarily out to convert the areas and completely transform the areas of their new conquest into Muslim states. Their objectives were different. The factors which motivated them were different. Different kinds of pressures began to work. And by the 11th and the 12th centuries, the coming of the Mongols, the immigrants who were fleeing from the Mongols, all wanted some kind of stability. They were looking for a place where they could establish their sway, where they could expect a degree of permanence and stability as far as their sovereignty was concerned.
The Arabs, the Ghaznavid and the Ghorid invasions brought the northwest provinces as well as North India in contact with Islam. In course of time, the pressure in the original homeland of these invaders, the Mongol threats, and of course the ground reality in North India brought a change in the focus. It moved into a direction that finally led to the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate.